Symphony No. 40 in G minor, first movement by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. There is much that we can learn about this work simply by looking at its title. So when we do so, we'll take a look at the genre of the work, the significance of the number of the symphony itself, and finally, the movement number. Since the genre of this work is identified as being a symphony, the following details should come to mind immediately. First of all, it is a concert work, and we might add that it is performed by orchestra, the kind of performing force that you would expect to find in a concert hall, not in a typical domestic setting, and that this composition has 4 movements in it. Now, the number of the symphony can be very useful to you because it can help you to identify who composed this work. Here we have a Symphony No. 40, and we have one composer in this unit who wrote 40 plus symphonies. So it should be easy for you to identify this work, Symphony No. 40, with a composer who wrote 40 plus symphonies, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Since this is the first movement of the work, we can be certain that it is cast in sonata allegro format. In fact, sonata allegro format is typical first movement format, and we know that it is always used for first movements in classical multi-movement instrumental compositions, at least in the 4 types of such works that we are examining in this unit. Before I point out any specific details of this work, I need to bring to your attention the fact that this is a textbook example of sonata allegro format. By that, I mean that it has all the elements that were taught to composition students beginning in the 1830s. Features that I have not told you about in my exposition of sonata allegro format. Basically, although the textbook model of sonata allegro format became the norm in the 19th century, it was definitely the exception during the classical era itself. So you will find certain details in this composition that I have not pointed out previously in connection with sonata allegro, such as a theme associated with the transition, and a theme associated with the cadence or the ending of the exposition. You don't have to worry about these details. In fact, you won't hear them in most of the sonata allegro format movements that you are likely to hear from the classical repertory. The theme of this movement, and in fact the whole movement itself, uses a 3-note rhythmic motive, short, short, long, ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum. And in fact, that's mostly what you're going to hear throughout the composition, various presentations of this rhythmic motive. We recall that classical melodies are created of motives, which are then repeated to create phrases, and those phrases are then repeated to create a melody. This is exactly what we're going to observe in the construction of the theme of this movement by Mozart. If you take a look at the first phrase of the theme, as I have diagrammed it here, you will see that the motive short, short, long is used 3 times in succession. Ba-ba-bum, 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 bum. And that at the end of it there is an extra note. But basically it's 3 presentations of the motive. And you can hear this clearly in the melody itself. Ba-ba-bum, 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 bum. And the rhythm of this phrase appears in the 3 following phrases of the melody. Ba-ba-bum, 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 bum, ba-ba-bum, 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 bum, ba-ba-bum, 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 bum, ba-ba-bum, 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 bum. So here you have a crystal clear example of the construction of a classical melody. That is, taking a motive and repeating it to create a phrase, repeating that phrase to create a melody. Now let's take a look at the listening outline of this work. If you take a look at it, you will see it has the typical parts that you expect to find in a sonata allegro format movement: exposition, development, recapitulation, and coda. You see that the exposition has a first theme, a transition, and a second theme. It has other melodic elements that are identified for you here, but those, remember, are part of the textbook model of sonata allegro format, not the typical classical movements that you are likely to hear. And speaking of things that you are likely to hear, please note that the exposition is repeated. This is very typical in 18th and early 19th century compositions using this movement format. Now, let's take a look at the development. One thing that you will notice about the development is right at the beginning you are presented with fragments of the theme. In fact, the theme seems to have been constructed so that it could be taken apart and so that its smallest element, the motive, short, short, long, is presented again and again. And that's exactly what you hear at the beginning of the development. Very shortly thereafter, the texture suddenly switches from monody, that is melody and accompaniment, to free polyphony, and the music suddenly sounds very, very animated. This is one of those contrapuntal accent sections that I have been telling you about. So as you listen to this composition, think of the typical texture of classical music, mostly monodic with contrapuntal accents. After this, the motive is echoed from one section of the orchestra to another, and then it enters the retransition, a preparation that takes you to the recapitulation or the restatement of the elements of the exposition. Now follow through the elements of the recapitulation carefully. They're going to sound familiar to you. Certainly the first theme is going to sound very much like it did the first time around. But beyond that, the music is going to sound slightly different, and the reason for this is simple. The tonal scheme of the exposition is different from the tonal scheme of the recapitulation. That means that certain elements of the exposition are going to be presented in different tonalities or keys here than they were the first time around. And you already know that by changing the key or the tonality of a work, you change the character of the work considerably. We saw that in that demonstration with changing something in major to something in minor. And here that sort of a transformation will be most evident in the second theme. In the exposition of this work, it was presented in major. However, in the recapitulation, in which everything is in minor, it's presented in minor, and so it has a completely different character from what it had before.